We would go walking together, go for a ride, go for something to eat, and go places like go thrift shop, and then he would collect movies.
Tonight, a mother breaks her silence to demand justice in the death of her son.
Is broken and will continue to be broken for some time. On day one, a very important thing will happen. A national standard will be applied as to what the best interests of the child are across Canada.
And what's in the mandate letter for the Indigenous Services Minister? Good evening. Welcome to APTN National News. I'm Melissa Ridgen. The family of a First Nations man is trying to find a way to move forward 2 months after his death. Nielson Catchway's body was found in Winnipeg's North End after being struck by a vehicle. As Brittany Hobson shows us, this isn't the first time the family has lost a loved one, but this time they hope to receive justice.
This is my place of comfort. This is where I find comfort.
Photographs line the walls of Nielson Catchway's room, while dozens and dozens of movies line another. This is where Martha Catchway goes to remember her son.
Where we would go walking together, go for a ride, go for something to eat, and go places like go thrift shop, and then he would collect movies, all kinds of movies, since he was about 10, 12 years old.
The 40-year-old lived with his mother most of his life. The two had an unbreakable bond. That changed one fatal day in October.
I heard a knock on a door, and then I was so happy. I went running from the kitchen to the door. I said, "He's home now, he's home now." And then to my surprise, there was 2 policemen standing there, I guess detectives.
Catchway's body was found in Winnipeg's North End. Police say he was assaulted and robbed. Shortly after, he was hit by a car. He later died in hospital. April Catchway says her brother was loved for his giving manner.
Everybody deserves life, and I feel that there was a very special life that was taken from many people, not only myself, but other family members, even the community, because Nielson used to help streetwalkers and stuff like that. He wasn't a violent person.
Catchway was a spiritual man. He attended the same Winnipeg church for 25 years. The last time April saw her brother, he imparted some words of wisdom.
He left me a little card that said, "Put your anxiety onto Christ." So, yeah, that's what he left me. So I have it hanging up on my wall now.
A 13 and 14-year-old were charged with manslaughter. They'll be in court next week. Police are still looking to speak with the driver of the vehicle. This is not the first tragedy for the family. Catchway's grandmother, Marie Catchway, was found on a street in the North End more than 30 years ago. Media at the time reported she had been beaten to death.
She loved her grandchildren. She loved everybody she met. She had a very caring heart, and how could somebody do that to her? Leave her there.
Her death remains unsolved. April was only 6 months old at the time.
I wish I could have had the opportunity to know my grandmother, because whoever that was took my grandmother from me. Obviously, I was too young to know her. I was only 6 months old at the time, so sometimes I feel like I was put on this earth to maybe try and fight for her case as well.
The family is preparing for their first Christmas without Catchway. Signs honoring their son and brother stand where a tree is normally placed. Next week, they will hold a vigil at the spot where he was found. But for now, Martha is leaning on the same faith that guided her son's life. Brittany Hobson, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
In Parliament's last day before the holidays, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau gave his ministers a gift, their mandate letters. Jamie Pashgumskum reports on that.
Indigenous Services Minister Mark Miller has been tasked with implementing Jordan's principle, helping Indigenous transition from diesel-fueled power to clean energy by 2030, and with improving infrastructure like health facilities, treatment centres, and schools in First Nations. He will also lead the implementation of the Liberals' new child welfare legislation, Bill C-92.
The system is broken and will continue to be broken for some time. On day one, a very important thing will happen. A national standard will be applied as to what the best interests of the child are across Canada, and that hasn't been the case. The next step is the most difficult step, which is to engage with communities and to come to agreements, and we call them coordination agreements, so that affirmation of jurisdiction can be done in a seamless fashion.
Miller said consultations on that could take up to a year. Manitoba NDP MP Leah Gazan is critical of the Liberals' intentions.
Certainly we see with the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruling, they say one thing, they do another. This is what the court has mentioned. The Liberal government says one thing and does another. I think they need to stop talking. I think they need to immediately comply with the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruling and pay families and children what they owe.
Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett's letter asked her to develop legislation for implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and to develop a national benefits sharing framework on resource projects in Indigenous territory. Meanwhile, Northern Affairs Minister Dan Vandel is to develop Inuit Nunavut policies and to implement Inuit land claim agreements. APTN reached out to Indigenous leaders for a response. The Inuit Taparit Kanatami declined. The Métis National Council was unavailable, and AFN says they are reviewing the mandates before they comment. Jamie Pashagumskum, APTN National News, Ottawa.
We always want to hear what you think. Here's how you can continue the conversation. You can send your emails to news@aptn.ca. You can find us online at aptnnews.ca and on youtube.com/aptn news. You can also follow APTN News on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for more Indigenous news. Earlier this week, APTN spoke with the Beaver First Nation, who say that they're fighting to protect their lands from being taken over for agricultural use. Now the province of Alberta says consultation with Indigenous communities comes first in regard to land sales. Mackenzie County in northern Alberta wants to purchase land that cuts into First Nations territory. They sent a letter directly to the province and bypassed First Nation leadership. Treaty 8 chiefs said they should have been included in that letter, while Jess Sinclair with the Alberta government says Mackenzie County was following procedure. They say consultation about the land purchase will now happen with the First Nation leadership and the provincial government.
Our first call as a government when making land use decisions is always consultation with affected First Nations and Métis groups. So the sale of any prospective parcel of Crown land in Mackenzie County is no exception to that.
Time for us to take a quick break. When we come back, APTN Investigates gives us a sneak peek at their documentary on how the Donald Marshall Jr. decision's been implemented 20 years later. Here's a look at tomorrow's weather. Off to the east coast, we've got -2 and sunshine in St. John's, +1 and sunny in Halifax. -18 and sunshine for Happy Valley Goose Bay, -21 and sunny in Kuujjuaq. Saguenay 1 and snow, Montreal sunshine and 1. Ottawa, mix of sun and clouds and 2 degrees. Peterborough, mostly sunny and 2. -16 and snow for Sioux Lookout, -14 and snow for Kapuskasing. -28 for Puckatawagan and Thompson, sunshine, -30 and sunny in Churchill. -16 and snow in Gimli and Winnipeg, -23 and sunny in Brandon. -12 and snow in Saskatoon, -18 and snow in Regina. -20 and snow in Buffalo Narrows, -32 and sunshine in Stony Rapids, and -34 and sunny in Uranium City. Welcome back. The Mi'kmaq celebrated the Marshall decision in 1999. In its ruling, the Supreme Court of Canada upheld treaty rights. 20 years later, Trina Roche takes a look at how well the government has implemented that ruling. Living Treaties Part 2 airs on APTN Investigates tonight. Last week, Trina joined Dennis Ward to talk about Part 2.
Trina, good to see you. Part 1 was really good. What can we expect here for Part 2?
This time we traveled to Listigouche, Quebec. So we're fishing with the community there. We're fishing again in southwest Nova Scotia. But this time, I think where part one really dealt with some of the historical context, this episode is much more focused on the ongoing negotiations that began in 2017 called the Rights Reconciliation Agreements. DFO sort of came back to the table with Mi'kmaq and Wolastoq and Passamaquoddy people to negotiate a new round of fishing deals. And so this one really looks at that process that's happening right now and ongoing.
What are the concerns with these new negotiations?
Yeah, the language, particularly under the Liberal government, has really changed around treaty rights, right? So they're talking about, recognition, reconciliation. They're saying that these new agreements do implement rights, but for the Mi'kmaq that I talk to, the ones that appear in the story, and a lot of people who are just off-camera conversations that I had, there's a real concern around, they're called rights reconciliation agreements, but what do they actually mean for rights? So that's a big question that I'm looking at in this part two, is how well is Canada implementing rights, particularly an agreement that's called rights reconciliation. So that's a big focus of this one.
Trina, what do you see happening going forward?
There's a lot of unanswered questions. 20 years later, the Supreme Court in the Marshall decision came up with the term a moderate livelihood. So the Mi'kmaq have a right to make a living, but what is a moderate livelihood? And so that's still undefined and unanswered. And I think at this point, the Mi'kmaq themselves are having a lot of conversations about what does that look like and what does that mean? The Mi'kmaq want to fish under their own rules. They want to be the architects of that. And so those are conversations that are sort of happening. But at the same time, Mi'kmaq fish harvesters are getting impatient. And so more and more we're seeing people just sort of going out and doing it. And when Mi'kmaq assert rights, we see conflict and tension. And so, we saw a boat burned in Membertou in the fall. And so I think there's a lot of work for both Canada and the Mi'kmaq leadership to do so that we don't see a repeat. Nobody wants to go back to the conflict and confrontation that happened after the initial Marshall decision. So I think there's a lot of work to do to make sure that we avoid that and that Mi'kmaq can practice their treaty rights in a sustainable, good way.
Trina, looking forward to part two. Thank you for coming on to talk to us about it.
Thanks, Dennis.
You can catch Living Treaties Part 2 tonight on APTN Investigates right after the news. In the last 20 years, Nunavut has seen an influx of newcomers, and youth are also more influenced by media and lifestyles beyond their territory. How do these external forces impact Inuit identity? Here is APTN's Charlotte Moore-Jacobs.
Nunavut have experienced drastic cultural change in the 21st century. Prefabricated homes, Western education, wireless internet, ATVs, and store-bought food are just a few modern moves. But what does it mean to be a Nook, or to even grow up in Nunavut for that matter?
Oh wait, you're from Nunavut, right? Yeah. So what about polar bears? And it's just I want to learn about photography. Can we not go through the 3 hours of backstory?
Terry Kuzuak asks this question frequently.
Go ahead.
She's a performing artist, studying her craft down south, but spending a lot of time back in her home community of Rankin Inlet.
It's when you're at your weakest that you figure out you're strong.
To ensure the continuation of innumerable aspects of oral traditions and beliefs, she sings.
But I got to find my own identity in traditional Inuit music. Yeah, and there are songs that are only remembered from listening to the person who wrote it sing it over and over and over again. So songs are very personal in nature. It's not like just showing a clip instantly. It is sung by the person who wrote it, usually, or a close friend. And the meaning behind them is always understood. And so when you share the song with someone, you always share the meaning of the song and what it's about. So the song itself is what's kept premium. That's my older sister, my cousin Bunno, and my other sister Norti.
Kuzuak says Inuit experience is different with each generation.
Yeah, I think in my parents' day and age, something was either Inuk or not Inuk. You either were Inuk or you weren't Inuk. Even if you were Inuk, but you were the way you spoke and the way you acted and everything else was white, then they were white. But now Inuit is just a spectrum. You know, I exist on the Inuk spectrum, but I wouldn't say that I'm more Inuk than my sisters. My sisters, I would think, are more Inuk than me, even though we have the same parents, because they speak Inuktitut. They're more interested in traditional things. They have more knowledge on those things. So I always adhere to, okay, they are more Inuk than me, but I am more Inuk than this person who grew up in Winnipeg. You know, so there people have that construct in their head of more or less Inuk. Classic baby photo.
But sometimes it can be challenging to reconcile the transition and dual presence of modern and traditional culture. Youth who use English do so out of practicality, not because they are turning their backs on tradition. This crossroad has made Mumilak Kakak the center of attention when it comes to identity.
If I have somebody that speaks Inuktitut fluently with me, because I don't, I do everything I can to not be a part of that conversation. Because as soon as somebody realizes I don't speak Inuktitut, it's like, why do you have those tattoos then? Who are you to have them? And
Kakak grew up in the isolated community of Baker Lake and honors her ancestry.
Because the point of me having tattoos is realizing that these two sides need to come together to move forward, for me to effectively help, for me to feel like I can own an identity, that it doesn't need to be one side or the other.
Youth we interviewed say older generations of Inuit don't always share their story on colonization and trauma, and younger Inuit are left in the dark. This has an impact on youth identity.
Stories that you hear and then you hear again as an adult, and you find out the stories are darker than you imagine because your parents are protecting you. And I have the benefit of having parents who are able to talk to me about these things. But there are other families where talking isn't within their value system. Not that they're better or worse, but it's just they don't talk about bad things, or they don't talk about things about before a certain time. There are people that, by talking about it, you're dredging it. And by keeping silent, you're leaving it to peace. So there are certainly different ranges of education among Inuit my age.
Straddling the gap between old and new world. Youth are looking up to role models like Dr. Donna Kimilarczyk, the first Inuk heart surgeon.
She had not grown up with the Inuk family, but when she had gone through that course, all of us were the first to say, she's the Inuk doing her thing. Amazing. So now that pride coin has flipped on its head. Being Inuk is not this rare tag that you get with the E number on it. Being Inuk is now this identifier where you can be proud behind it.
Kuzuak retains and transforms her Inuk identity. Growing up only knowing Nunavut as its own territory, she is proud. Charlotte Mort-Jacobs, APTN National News, reporting from Iqaluit and Rankin Inlet.
Time for us to take another break. When we come back, an eagle versus an octopus. No joke. First, here's the rest of tomorrow's weather. Off to northern Alberta, we've got minus 26 in snow in Fort Chip, minus 60 in sunshine in Peace River. Minus 5 in sunshine for Edmonton, minus 2 mix of sun and clouds in Calgary. 3 and a mix of sun and clouds in Penticton, 7 in sunshine for Tofino. Minus 18 and sunny in Fort Nelson, minus 4 in snow in Smithers. Minus 19 and a mix of sun and cloud in Dawson City. Clear skies and minus 19 in Beaver Creek. Minus 28 and sunny in Wrigley, minus 32 and sunshine in Fort Simpson. minus 29 and sunshine for Colville Lake. Paulatuk, minus 25 and sunny. Minus 34 in snow for Baker Lake, minus 32 in snow for Chesterfield. Minus 28 snow in Igloolik, minus 16 in snow in Cape Dorset and Pangaretung. Welcome back. Celebrated Cree artist Kent Monkman returned home to Winnipeg with his exhibit, Shame and Prejudice. Jolene Banning went over to the Winnipeg Art Gallery for a look-see. Here's another look at that story.
The provocative and moving artwork of Cree artist Kent Monkman opened at the Winnipeg Art Gallery. The exhibit, Shame and Prejudice, A Story of Resilience, aims to highlight the many different devastating periods in time that First Nations people survived, including genocidal policies like residential schools, as well as mass incarceration and displacement. Showcasing this exhibit is just one way Stephen Boyers, CEO of the Winnipeg Art Gallery, is working to indigenize the space.
By truly amplifying the voices of Indigenous artists in Canada and beyond, and in partnership with the WAG's own Indigenous Advisory Circle, we have endeavored to respond to the TRC's calls to action.
That's not all the WAG has done to respond to the calls to action. There is now Indigenous representation on staff and the board of directors, and artists are given space for their work that focuses on issues specific to their perspectives, like changing a history that would have Indigenous peoples erased or replaced altogether with the white narrative.
These are places that Indigenous people have been living in for thousands of years, and it was really to refute these ideas that were brought by Europeans. You know, European modernity was about coming to North America with a blank slate and having everybody just conveniently forget that this land belonged to somebody else.
Although the exhibit takes a life-size visceral look at Indigenous loss and pain, it also shows a lot more.
This show, even though it tackles some very dark chapters, it's really intended to be very optimistic, to talk about the resiliency of our people to survive, you know, these different acts of genocide through the colonial project.
The exhibit will be on display until February 2020, and thanks to an anonymous donor, the deposition from Monkman's Urban Res series will now have a permanent home at the WAG. I'm Jolene Banning for APTN National News in Winnipeg.
And now for a wild story off the northwest coast of Vancouver Island. Maui Canada West Fish Farm staff caught on camera a sight not usually seen. A bald eagle swooped down trying to catch a massive octopus, but found out quickly that it had bitten off more than it could chew. The octopus was not about to be calamari that day, and it wrapped its tentacles around the thunderbird in a death grip. Fish farm staff intervened and freed the bird. It flew to a nearby low-hanging branch, apparently stunned by what had happened. The raging octopus eventually went back down under the sea, while the eagle is believed to have suffered nothing more than a bruised ego and flew off 10 minutes later. Thanks to Maui West Canada for that amazing video. That's your news for this Friday. Hit up our website if you missed anything. I'm Melissa Ridgen. Have a great night. I'll see you back here tomorrow.
Go to the bottom.